August 14th, 1943. Camp Hearn, Texas. The air was thick enough to drink, a humid blanket saturated with the scent of pine and dust. For Oberstfreiter Klaus Wagner, every breath was a labor. The shrapnel from the American artillery shell near Bizerta had torn through his left leg, and the subsequent infection had raged for weeks, first in the filth of a field dressing station, then in the suffocating hold of a transport ship. He had been told what to expect. The Americans, a mongrel race of gangsters and degenerates, would offer no mercy. They were capitalists who saw prisoners as liabilities. He would be left to die, his leg rotting until gangrene claimed him. This was the logic of his world. This was the certainty of his Führer. He lay on a stretcher, squinting against the brutal Texas sun, as two American guards, impossibly tall and well-fed, carried him towards a long wooden building. It did not look like an execution shed. It smelled of antiseptic. Inside, the air was cooler. The floor was clean, polished to a dull shine. A man in a white coat approached, his voice calm, speaking English that an orderly translated into clipped German. He was a doctor. He examined the wound with a detached professionalism that was more unsettling than outright cruelty. There was no sneer, no ideological lecture. There was only a diagnosis. Klaus Wagner expected a saw. He expected a crude amputation followed by a slow death. Instead, he was wheeled into a room brighter than any he had ever seen. There was a metal table surrounded by intricate machines and trays of gleaming instruments. The doctor spoke again, the translator relaying the words. They were going to save the leg. They had a new drug, something called penicillin. It would fight the infection. They would perform a surgery to remove the metal fragments and repair the damaged tissue. He was given an anesthetic. He slipped into darkness, convinced it was a trick, a final, elaborate cruelty. He awoke hours later in a clean bed with white sheets. The throbbing in his leg had been replaced by a dull, manageable ache. A bottle of clear fluid dripped slowly into his arm through a thin tube. The wound was dressed in sterile white gauze. He was weak, but he was alive. His leg was still there. In that quiet, sterile room, thousands of miles from the ruin of the Third Reich, the first crack appeared in the foundation of his entire world. This is not a story about the clash of armies. It is not about tactical genius or strategic blunders. It is the story of an ideology's demolition. It is the story of how a system of belief, forged in racial arrogance and sustained by lies, was systematically dismantled not by a bomb, but by a bandage, not by a bullet, but by a dental filling. This is the story of how the overwhelming, unimaginable, and casually delivered industrial and logistical supremacy of the United States, expressed through its prisoner of war medical system, became the most effective denazification program ever conceived. It was a psychological war won by accident, a battle for the mind waged in operating theaters and infirmaries across the American heartland. To understand the depth of this shock, one must first understand the certainty of the German soldier. He was the product of a decade of relentless indoctrination. The Nazi propaganda machine, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, had painted a vivid, terrifying, and contemptuous portrait of the United States. Americans were not a real people. They were a chaotic jumble of races, a half-Judaized, half-negrified society, as Adolf Hitler wrote in Mein Kampf. Their culture was shallow, defined by jazz music, Hollywood fantasies, and gangsterism. Their men were soft, their leaders corrupt, and their industrial might a bluff, a house of cards built on Jewish finance. This was not merely background noise. It was the core of their fighting belief. German soldiers were taught that their racial purity and Spartan discipline made them inherently superior. A captured German propaganda pamphlet intended for troops warned, "The American soldier has no ideals. He is fighting for a business. He is a mercenary." They were told stories of American barbarism, of prisoners shot out of hand, of medical experiments conducted on the captured. The Geneva Convention was presented as a quaint document the decadent Americans would never honor. Fear was a tool of control. Contempt was a tool of morale. The German soldier went into battle against Americans believing he was facing an opponent who was both morally degenerate and materially overrated. This worldview was reinforced by the material realities of the German war effort. By 1943, the German military and home front were already feeling the strain of a prolonged, multi-front war. Scarcity was a fact of life. A German infantryman was lucky to have adequate morphine for a serious wound. Sulfa drugs, the best available defense against infection in the Wehrmacht, were rationed. Basic medical supplies like cotton bandages, iodine, and surgical thread were in increasingly short supply, especially on the brutal Eastern Front. A soldier's long-term health was a secondary concern to his immediate utility as a fighting man. Chronic conditions were ignored. Dental problems were left to fester. A man's value was measured by his ability to hold a rifle, and the medical system was designed with one primary goal: return him to the front as quickly as possible, in any condition. This was the world from which the prisoners came. It was a world of make do and mend, of brutal efficiency, of scarcity, and of ideological hatred for the enemy. It was a world that had no frame of reference for what they were about to encounter. The journey itself was the first assault on their senses. After capture in North Africa or Italy, they were herded onto transport ships. They expected squalor, starvation, and disease. They found something else. The Liberty ships, the products of an industrial base the German High Command had dismissed as inefficient, were Spartan but clean. The food, while basic, was plentiful. They were fed 3 meals a day, often including meat, white bread, and coffee with sugar, luxuries that had become distant memories for their families back in Germany. A German prisoner named Wolfgang Nebel later recalled his astonishment. "We were given chocolate and cigarettes. We thought it must be a mistake. Or perhaps they were fattening us up for some terrible purpose." The true shock began upon arrival in America. The country itself was a physical refutation of Goebbels's propaganda. There were no bomb craters. The cities gleamed with electric lights. The sheer number of civilian automobiles on the roads was a spectacle that left many speechless. But it was inside the camps that the ideological demolition began in earnest. The United States would ultimately house over 371,000 German prisoners in a network of 155 base camps and 511 smaller branch camps, a logistical undertaking of staggering scale. And for every camp, there was a clinic. For every large camp, there was a fully functioning hospital. These were not crude first aid stations. The main camp hospitals were often 200-bed facilities, built to the same standards as cantonment hospitals for American soldiers. They were staffed by United States Army Medical Corps personnel, including doctors, dentists, nurses, and technicians. They were equipped with modern operating rooms, X-ray machines, laboratories, and dental clinics. The level of care was dictated not by malice or contempt, but by the cold, bureaucratic language of the Geneva Convention, which stipulated that prisoners of war must receive the same level of medical care as the detaining power's own soldiers. The United States, with its boundless resources, interpreted this directive literally and applied it with industrial efficiency. The numbers tell a story that no propaganda could withstand. Consider the dental care. In the war-torn German army, a soldier with a toothache might have it crudely pulled without anesthetic. In the American POW camps, the goal was preservation. Over the course of the war, Army dentists performed more than 17 million fillings for German prisoners. They fitted over 45,000 pairs of dentures. They performed tens of thousands of root canals and cleanings. One German POW, a former farmer named Hans, entered Camp Shelby, Mississippi, with a mouth full of rotten teeth, a condition he had endured for a decade. He left 2 years later with a full set of porcelain dentures, courtesy of the United States government. He wrote in a letter home, a letter heavily censored but whose meaning was clear. "They have given me an American smile. How could a soldier reconcile the image of the barbaric American gangster with the patient, meticulous dentist who spent hours rebuilding his teeth?" It was the same with eyesight. Many German soldiers had poor vision, a condition that had never been addressed by the Wehrmacht. In the American camps, they were given eye exams. If they needed glasses, they were prescribed them. The Army's medical logistics system, which was already supplying millions of American soldiers, simply added the prisoners to its requisitions. Over 120,000 pairs of eyeglasses were manufactured and distributed to German prisoners of war. A young infantryman who had spent the war squinting at the world was suddenly able to see it clearly for the first time, through lenses made in Rochester, New York. The clarity was more than just physical. The surgical care was perhaps the most profound shock. The camps performed over 13,000 major surgical operations and 60,000 minor ones. These were not just life-saving procedures for battlefield wounds. Doctors repaired hernias that soldiers had lived with for years. They removed appendixes, gallbladders, and tumors. They set old, poorly healed fractures. They used techniques and medicines that were virtually unknown to the German military. Penicillin, the American miracle drug, was used liberally. Developed and mass-produced in the United States on a scale the Axis powers could not imagine, it was available to treat infections in captured enemies. A German soldier could die of sepsis from a simple infected cut on the Eastern Front, while his captured comrade in a Texas POW camp was being saved by a drug that represented the absolute pinnacle of the enemy's scientific and industrial might. The contrast was a constant, gnawing presence in the prisoners' minds. They read letters from home describing the ever-dwindling rations, the lack of soap, the scarcity of medicine. And then they would sit down to a meal in the mess hall. The average caloric intake for a German POW was between 3,500 and 4,000 calories per day, adhering to the same standards as for American soldiers. This was often double the ration for civilians in Germany. They received meat several times a week. They had unlimited access to white bread, a food item that had become a symbol of impossible luxury back home. Former prisoner of war Gunter Bischoff recalled, "We were all gaining weight. We were healthier in the camp than we had been in the last 2 years of the war. We saw pictures in the newspapers of our starving families, and then we looked at our own plates. The confusion was enormous. This abundance was not kindness. It was logistics. It was the byproduct of a system so vast, so productive, that providing for hundreds of thousands of enemies was a trivial rounding error in the national balance sheet. The United States was a nation that produced so much food that it had to pay its farmers to grow less. It was a nation whose factories were churning out an airplane every 5 minutes and a ship every day. Providing dental care for a German corporal was, in this context, a simple, bureaucratic act. But for the corporal, it was a world-altering revelation. The psychological impact began to compound. The first stage was disbelief. Many prisoners assumed the good treatment was a temporary deception, a prelude to something terrible. They hoarded food, convinced it would soon be taken away. They eyed the doctors with suspicion, believing the medicine might be poison. But the good treatment never stopped. The food kept coming. The doctors continued their work with unwavering professionalism. Disbelief slowly gave way to confusion. The confusion was rooted in the collapse of their core beliefs. They had been taught that democracy was weak and inefficient. Yet they were now cogs in a democratic system of logistics so efficient it was terrifying. They had been taught that Americans were racially inferior and undisciplined. Yet they were being treated by doctors and guarded by soldiers who were professional, organized, and displayed a power that was quiet, confident, and absolute. A pivotal moment of cognitive dissonance often occurred when German prisoners encountered Jewish American personnel. According to their entire worldview, Jews were the ultimate enemy, the subversive, parasitic race that Germany was fighting to eradicate. Yet, in the camps, they met them as doctors, dentists, and administrators. A German officer, a staunch party member, was brought to a hospital in Fort Bragg with a life-threatening case of pneumonia. The doctor who worked tirelessly to save his life, administering penicillin and sitting by his bedside, was Captain Isidor Rosen, a Jewish physician from Brooklyn. The officer survived. After his recovery, he reportedly asked for a private meeting with the doctor. No record exists of what was said, but other prisoners noted that the officer never again gave the Hitler salute during morning roll call. How could an ideology survive such a direct contradiction? The man who was supposed to be his mortal, subhuman enemy had just saved his life with compassion and professionalism, using a miracle drug created by the society that enemy represented. The entire edifice of Nazi racial theory, so grand and absolute in a Nuremberg rally, became fragile and absurd in the quiet sterility of that hospital room. This process was repeated in thousands of individual, unrecorded moments across the country. A prisoner in Camp Clinton, Mississippi, who had his appendix removed by a black surgeon. A soldier in Fort Douglas, Utah, who was taught English by a female university professor as part of the camp's re-education program. Each interaction was a small chip hammered out of the ideological wall. They had been taught America was a land of chaos, they saw order. They had been taught it was a land of hatred. They experienced a detached, bureaucratic, and sometimes genuine form of care. The mortality rates provide the final, brutal statistical evidence. In the American POW camp system, the overall mortality rate from all causes, including pre-existing wounds, disease, and accidents, was approximately 0.3%. This figure is astoundingly low, comparable to the mortality rate for a healthy, civilian population of the same age group at the time. Now, compare this to the fate of prisoners in German hands. Over 57% of the Soviet prisoners of war captured by the Germans died in captivity. That is not a mortality rate, it is an extermination rate. For British and American prisoners in German camps, the rate was around 4%, still more than 10 times higher than the rate for German prisoners in America. The prisoners knew this. They may not have known the exact statistics, but they saw the reality. They saw that almost everyone who entered the camp medical system survived. They knew from their own experiences on the front that this was not normal. They understood that a system that could afford this level of survivability for its enemies was a system operating on a different plane of existence. It was a power not of rhetoric, but of reality. The climax of this story was not a single event. It was a slow, creeping, and then sudden realization that washed over the prisoner population. It was the understanding that the war was not just lost, it had been lost from the very beginning. Germany had never stood a chance. The final proof was not in the news of Normandy or the fall of Berlin. It was in the evidence of their own senses. A former Africa Corps NCO, interviewed in the 1980s, articulated the moment of his ideological collapse. "I had been a true believer," he said. "I believed in the Führer, in our destiny, in the superiority of our blood. I was captured in Tunisia with dysentery, and I weighed maybe 45 kilos. I was sure I would die. In the camp in Alabama, they nursed me back to health. But the moment for me, the real moment, was when I broke a tooth on a piece of bread. I reported it. The next day, I was in a dental chair. The dentist, a young man, he drilled the tooth and gave me a silver filling. A silver filling. For a prisoner. For me. My brother, fighting on the Eastern Front, had written to me that he had a tooth pulled with pliers by a sergeant. And I, a prisoner, was getting a silver filling." He paused in the interview, his memory still vivid after 40 years. In that moment, sitting in that chair, I knew. It was all over. A country that could afford to put silver in the teeth of its captured enemies had a power we could not even comprehend. All the speeches of Goebbels, all the parades, all the flags, they were nothing. The war was over. America had not just defeated our armies. It had defeated our entire idea of the world. This was the true surrender. It was not a signature on a document in a railway car. It was a quiet, internal admission of absolute defeat, repeated in the minds of hundreds of thousands of men. It was the dawning realization that they had sacrificed everything, their youth, their health, their comrades, their country, for a lie. And the proof of that lie was the inexplicable, overwhelming, and undeniable evidence of American abundance and systemic power. After the war ended, the prisoners were prepared for repatriation. But their transformation was not yet complete. The United States, in a final demonstration of its logistical might, launched a program to re-educate the most ardent Nazis before sending them home. They were shown films of the liberation of the concentration camps. The horrific images of emaciated bodies and mass graves were the final, devastating blow. The system that had fed them, healed them, and given them new teeth was now showing them the ultimate, depraved consequences of the ideology they had served. The juxtaposition was absolute. The America that had shown them such impersonal, systematic care was the same America that had uncovered the ultimate expression of Germany's systematic hate. The re-education programs, the formal classes on democracy and American history, had a mixed record of success. But the unintentional re-education that had taken place in the hospitals, dental clinics, and mess halls was a profound and lasting success. These men returned to a Germany in ruins, a nation starved and broken. They brought with them not just their restored health, but a new perspective. They had seen the reality behind the propaganda. They had lived inside the engine of their enemy's power and had been, in a strange way, nourished by it. The final statistical summary serves as the irrefutable epilogue to this psychological war. Over 371,000 prisoners of war held on American soil. A network of over 650 camps built and supplied from scratch. Over 17 million dental fillings. Over 120,000 pairs of eyeglasses. Over 13,000 major surgeries. A diet exceeding 3,500 calories per day. A mortality rate of 0.3%. Each number is a nail in the coffin of the Nazi ideology. Each number represents a quiet, personal encounter that chipped away at a worldview built on lies. Each number is a testament to a power so vast that it could afford to be humane, not out of moral superiority, but out of sheer, overwhelming industrial capacity. The war was won on the beaches of Normandy and in the skies over Germany. It was won by the courage of soldiers and the genius of commanders. But a different kind of war was also won, a war for the future. It was won in the quiet, sterile rooms of the American prisoner of war camp system. It was a victory achieved not through destruction, but through demonstration. America did not just defeat the German soldier. It defeated his certainty. It dismantled his reality. It showed him that the world he had been taught to believe in, a world of racial hierarchies, of Spartan superiority, of decadent, weak democracies, was a fantasy. The truth was delivered not in a lecture, but on a dinner plate. The truth was administered not through a loudspeaker, but through an intravenous drip. The most effective weapon against the National Socialist worldview was not a Sherman tank or a B-17 bomber. It was a clean bed. It was a pair of dentures. It was an ampoule of penicillin administered to an enemy by a doctor who saw not a political object, but a patient. In the end, the system of racial hatred was brought down by a system of logistical mastery. And the minds of a generation of soldiers were changed not by what they were told, but by what they saw, and by the shocking, undeniable, and world-altering experience of American care. The war ended, and they went home, forever haunted by the memory of an enemy who had defeated them not just with steel, but with a baffling, terrifying, and absolute abundance.